The cinematic adaptation of Superman blew critics and audiences away when first released in 1978. Sold with the effective tagline of "You'll believe a man can fly," fans of the character and general audiences embraced the semi-serious approach to the character and were dazzled by the groundbreaking effects, which justified its tagline a million times over. It established Christopher Reeve as the platinum standard portrayal of the character we all know and love, and legitimized comic book movies as not only profitable, but something that could be enjoyed and loved by those who never even picked up a comic book. All comic book filmmakers have since praised it and in some way paid tribute to director Richard Donner and his cast and crew for what could be possible for this genre. In recent years, however, especially with the onslaught of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Christopher Nolan's brilliant Dark Knight films, and the failed DC Extended Universe, there has been a harsh and cynical reevaluation of this film and early comic book movies, because they are seen as old and dated compared to the films of now. Is this reevaluation correct? We'll see as I examine Richard Donner's Superman the Movie. The first Superman film was conceived as a two-part saga to be filmed simultaneously. This film is the Part 1, The Origin of Superman. We begin on the planet Krypton, after sowing the seeds for the sequel, where Jor-El, played by Marlon Brando, warns the planet will be destroyed in a matter of days, but is ignored by the Grand Council. He and his wife Lara, played by Susanna York, decide to send their infant son Kal-El in a rocket ship to Earth, where he will survive and blend in. The infant is found on Earth by Jonathan and Martha Kent, played by Glenn Ford and Phyllis Thaxter, who raise him as Clark Kent. One day, Clark finds a green crystal sent by Jor-El and leaves the farm to discover who he is. In the Arctic Circle, he uses the green crystal to create the Fortress of Solitude and discovers an AI of Jor-El, who teaches him the extent and limitations of his powers on Earth. After 12 years of training, Clark, now played by Christopher Reeve, moves to Metropolis to become a reporter for the Daily Planet, where he meets the fiery reporter Lois Lane, played by Margot Kidder. Lois sees Clark as an awkward and undateable man, and it leads to a lot of funny moments between the two. When Lois is involved in a dangerous helicopter accident, Superman reveals himself to the public, and after solving small-scale crimes and large-scale catastrophes, becomes a beloved figure in Metropolis. Lois interviews Superman, and the two begin to fall in love. All the while, the dastardly Lex Luthor, played by Gene Hackman, is concocting a plot in which he will use hijacked nuclear weapons to destroy California and remake the remaining land in his own image. Superman must find a way to stop him. The plot of Superman is of epic proportions, which only makes sense given its larger-than-life source material. It wisely takes its time to develop the character, and for younger viewers coming in fresh, while also bringing to life the colorful panels of the comic book older viewers would have grown up with. Taking this amount of time in a comic book movie can result in an audience becoming bored if done wrong, which many cite here as an issue. In retrospect, these scenes are indeed very deliberately paced, but by doing this, the key moments of Superman's mythos naturally flow from one to the other, so we understand how the world works and what exactly the rules are. This will come in handy later when we get to the biggest criticism of the film. The initial scribe for the film was Mario Puzo, of The Godfather Parts 1 and 2. His foundation and structure of the screenplay is largely what you see on screen, and how the story progresses. However, upon further rewrites in which he was not involved, the execution went from epic to more akin of the Batman TV series from the 60s, aka campy and silly. When original director Guy Hamilton removed himself from production, the producers turned to Richard Donner, hot off the thriller The Omen. Donner hated the draft he was given and recruited his dear friend Tom Mankiewicz to help him reshape the film and execute the film as the way the character was intended, straightforward, but not taken too seriously. As Donner simply put it, the key was finding the verisimilitude of the story. Defined as the appearance of being true or real, Donner instructed the production to find the reality inside of something as out there as Superman. If he flies, for example, then so be it, he flies. Their job was to make that image appear or feel real, thus achieving verisimilitude. This tone permeated every element of the story and characters, and the departments behind the scenes. That tone helps connect the three seemingly disparaging sequences, Krypton, Smallville, and Metropolis, together seamlessly, without feeling too jarring or too unbelievable. Donner knew that the photographic look had to be captured in a fanciful yet grounded way for such an epic story. Enlisting Oscar-winning cinematographer Jeffrey Unsworth and Oscar-winning Star Wars production designer John Barry to create a poetic dream-like world that still felt grounded in some kind of reality. This began the trend of updating the superhero genre for contemporary times in film, while trying to retain classic elements and themes throughout. The cinematography is beautiful, as Unsworth and camera operator Peter McDonald create sweeping, modern epic movement in the frame, photographed through a dreamlike and soft filter, combining the nostalgic with the contemporary. It really is a tragedy that Unsworth never saw the finished film, as he passed away before the final cut was projected. It was truly one of his finest hours as a cameraman. John Barry's sets in front of the lens combine the realistic sets of the Daily Planet and Luthor's underground Grand Central Station lair with the fanciful crystalline abstract angles of Krypton and the Fortress of Solitude. To this day, when one imagines Krypton, we think of this look for the doomed planet more than any other, because it's so striking to the eye. Even when we transition to the golden wheat fields of Kansas, it is both a fanciful portrayal of rural America, but in the same realistic plane that still feels tangible to the viewer. The verisimilitude of these sets are how reality and fantasy are literally presented as parallel to one another throughout the story. The biggest challenge the crew faced was not only making the story and characters believable, but the very idea of Superman tangible. Superman is a character who can fly. That was and still is one of the basic truths of his identity. No character had flown successfully on screen, and a variety of tricks and effects were tried, but proved ineffective. Donner was insistent that these effects be innovative and original. This, chief among other issues, caused tensions between him and the producers. But for Donner and his cast and crew, this was a mission to convince audiences that a man could fly and look real. The production used every trick in the book, and even created some new tricks for the book to make Superman fly and the world come to life. From rear projection, new Zoptic zoom shots, miniatures, wirework, gimbals, and matte paintings, the crew worked diligently throughout production to make Superman fly, and boy did they succeed. A criticism leveled at the movie today is that the flying scenes are fake-looking and unrealistic. Indeed, certain shots aren't wholly convincing nowadays, and sometimes you can detect the optical process lines, but the shots still feel more real than some of the CGI counterparts of today, because these effects feel more creative in their execution and use real people most, if not all, the time. There have been several great performances of the character of Superman over the years, but I'm one of those people who sees Christopher Reeve as the greatest Superman there ever was. Even though the sequels dipped sharply in quality following this film, the consistent presence and performances of Reeve saved them from being total disasters. And unknown at the time, he approached the part with class and real thought in how to make Clark and Superman seem total opposites. For Clark, he wears big glasses and acts like a socially awkward goof. As Superman, he stands tall and exudes goodness and confidence, and we definitely believe him when he says that he has come to fight for truth, justice, and the American way. Reeve smartly decides not to pose or strut around the set, but rather let the costume and his dialogue speak for themselves. He was one of the few Superman actors on screen to show how the flying should and can be done. He makes it look so easy. This movie, in my opinion, sums up in 1 minute what the entirety of Man of Steel failed to do. After a deeply romantic flight with Lois, Superman comes back to the apartment as Clark. Lois disappears into the other room for 1 second. He takes off his glasses, stands tall, looks at his glasses, and a look of guilt comes on his face, and begins to speak in his normal voice, ready to confess his feelings and secret to Lois. But she comes back, and he immediately reverts back to Clark. Here, we see not only how the disguise works, but also the inner soul of Superman at play. Literally showing, not telling. What makes this masterclass moment work was Christopher Reeve, and it's further proof of why he was simply the best. Here's a little bonus for you. Christopher Reeve has admitted in interviews that his Clark persona was largely based on Cary Grant's performance in Bringing Up Baby. If you want a great, funny movie to watch, check that one out. It's superb. Writer Tom Mankiewicz said Richard Donner believed if the love story between Superman and ace reporter Lois Lane worked, the rest of the film would work as well. The late Margot Kidder won the role because of her own smart approach to her character, along similar lines to that of Reeve. She approaches Lois as a ballsy modern woman who loves the thrill of getting the scoop, even if it does land her in peril. What makes her interesting is how she easily disregards Clark as an undesirable weakling, and yet harbors a schoolgirl crush on Superman, which leads to terrific chemistry between her and Christopher Reeve. Why I disregard the criticism directed toward Kidder herself is that she plays Lois like a real person, with a real personality, and not in any way trying to lampshade the character or act like a damsel in distress, which sadly many other versions do. It's a credit to her that many of the Loises that followed either directly stole from her or in some way reference her. It's a wonderful tribute to Kidder. This film is one of those epics which features a cast a pin feather short of perfection, which is the highest compliment I can give a movie in those terms. Brando as Jor-El was paid a record sum, but according to all involved, he was professional and actually came to love what he was doing on this film. Hackman was a serious actor who had rarely shown a comic side, and here he gets really fun things to do and say, especially when interacting with his cronies. The bumbling Otis, played hilariously by Ned Beatty, and the voluptuous Miss Tessmacher, played by Valerie Perrine. The rest of the cast are splendid as well. Jackie Cooper and Mark McClure bring great life to the Daily Planet. Great British stage stars Trevor Howard, Harry Andrews, and Susanna York bring a touch of class to Krypton. And never forget the down-to-earth charm of Glenn Ford and Phyllis Thaxter as the Kents. No actor in this film gave a bad or even weak performance. Then again, that's extremely hard to find in a Richard Donner helmed movie, as he is the king of getting good acting from his actors across the board. Reeves' virtuous turn as Superman is mirrored by a wonderfully villainous turn by Gene Hackman as the dastardly Lex Luthor. Hackman has been criticized in recent years for being over the top and too silly as Lex Luthor simply because he is prone to a big ego and cracking jokes, 90% of which never fail to make me chuckle and grin every time I watch it. I feel that we're more used to a modern Lex Luthor, who is not particularly interesting, as he has very little to do, or because he is seen as an arch and overly stereotypical villain. If the old one is boring and silly, then how do you argue with his first scene in the entire picture? To protect his whereabouts from a cop, Lex straight up pushes him in front of an oncoming train, and thinks nothing of it, proceeding as if this is business as usual. This does two things. One, poses what kind of a threat Luthor really is. Two, how he relishes in his own genius and ego, even going so far as to destroy most of California simply because he wants to slap his own image over it. The second half of the movie is ultimately dedicated to Luthor's big scheme, which is that of a typical Bond villain of the time, in using big crazy schemes that the audience is supposed to roll with, defying all logic. However, because we understand the methods of his madness, we know at this point he would totally disregard the lives of innocent people because of his ironclad will to remake the Earth in his own image. The third act is mostly the destruction of California wrought by Luthor, and the serious danger posed to the people and Superman's loved ones. This plot can occasionally feel at odds with the first half, but it resolves itself perfectly by the climax of the film. This one is going to be tricky, as everyone seems to know the ending of this movie, so I will try to be fair without revealing too much. Superman turning the world backwards to time travel and fix the damage caused by the missile is extremely silly, and it doesn't make a lick of sense. When you think about it from a real-life perspective, the opening of this movie contains a child reading the panels of a comic book. Therefore, we can totally assume that what's happening is within reason the logic of a comic book story. Even Jor-El has pointed out there is one rule Superman is not supposed to break. He says it twice in the film. It is forbidden for you to interfere with human history. By uttering that very line, it's established that he has that kind of power in this world. And because the film opens with that comic book, we understand that this world is basically set up to allow something like this to exist. Granted, a few editing mistakes following this move can confuse audiences and even frustrate them. But for me, the issue is minuscule and doesn't ruin the movie for me in any way. Plus, I always argue that if people can forgive the convoluted logic of Avengers Endgame, then surely this movie can be forgiven as well, especially for the time it was written. One of the very few elements of this movie that escapes criticism is the amazing score, composed by the legend himself, John Williams. Williams is the greatest living composer of all time, and Superman was written during an amazing hot streak of great films and scores he was producing, like Star Wars, Jaws, and Indiana Jones. This sweeping symphonic masterwork has it all. Big grand moments of action, such as the big rescue during the helicopter sequence, to the mournful and subtle death of Jonathan Kent in the Fortress of Solitude. Williams also wrote two of his finest pieces of all in this score. His love theme between Superman and Lois is wonderful, full of brimming passion, and let out in a wonderful flourish. The other is the signature Superman March, which cannot be separated from the character, try as some composers might. This is easily in my top 5 favorite film scores of all time, except for a few others coming close to beating it, and in the case of superhero movies, will remain the pinnacle and platinum standard of superhero scores. And just a quick listen to some of the tracks will reveal the true genius of John Williams. I think the reason why this movie still works, above all else, is how truthful and simple its themes and ideas are. Too often nowadays we are bombarded with superhero films and online, quote-unquote, discussions about the merit of these films without really taking into account what made a superhero work in the first place. Superman was created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster during the Great Depression, and offered kids, and even adults, an escape, and someone to look up to when others had failed. Superman the movie was made when the United States was reeling from both the Vietnam War and Watergate, two huge, unresolved blemishes the country has yet to fully reckon with. Here, Jor-El and Jonathan Kent tell Superman he is here for a reason, to be a beacon for those ideals that seem to slip away between childhood and adulthood. When people crowded into cinemas to see their childhood icon fly, They were reminded of those times when a man that could fly felt real in their minds, and his ideals of truth, justice, and the undying faith in humanity, or as Jor-El puts it, their capacity for good, were something real, tangible, and worth remembering and fighting for. I think that's why more modern takes on the Caped Wonder are hit and miss. A few seem to understand what makes the character tick, while some think he can't work in this modern world, but don't ever have a legitimate answer as to why that is, except to throw him into the darkest holes that we feel almost every day. One all too familiar at the time of this recording, during the COVID-19 outbreak. Superman is a reminder of a simpler time, both in terms of cinema history and our own childhood innocence. Even an image as simple as Christopher Reeve smiling at us as he flies away in the final shot of the film can honestly leave us with such a good feeling, and a sense of hope even, as the credits begin to roll. Superman the movie is a minor miracle in the way that it legitimized the idea that comic book characters can be brought to the screen in a credible and amazing way. And even though the production itself was deeply troubled and caused drama that would affect its sequel in profound ways, the rewards seem to justify the troubles. The story works very well and feels very true to the original characters and set up by Siegel, Schuster, and company, and yet remains its own unique signature in the pantheon of the mythos of the last son of Krypton. The cast is splendid, and each made deep impressions on how the characters would be played in the future adaptations of Superman. The effects are groundbreaking and creative, paving the way for more films to feature flying characters. The screenplay works beautifully and has a solid foundation and a solid execution. I cannot say enough for Richard Donner, as he ranks in the top 5 favorite directors of mine. He was the right choice for the material and took the movie into legendary status. My final ranking, 9.5 out of 10. Personally, when I see the poster with the tagline, "You'll believe a man can fly," well, I believe that as well.